Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. What I do is just get into what I believe to be the 7 biggest storylines in the SEC heading into the 2022 season. Let's get into it. SEC Media Days start today. Here are the 7 biggest stories of the season. Number 1, how about my dogs? And really, number 1 is pretty straightforward. It is, what does Georgia have for an encore? Now, we talked about this a little bit last week or 2 weeks ago in the biggest storylines of the college football season. Some of these will be a little bit repetitive, but what I would say about Georgia, for the first time in over 40 years, since before many of you were born, I think before most of you were probably born, Georgia is entering the season as the reigning national champion. And I think it's just been fascinating to kind of follow this offseason. Do you ever remember a program that had waited this long to reach the ultimate goal that has been talked about less in the offseason? Now, Kirby Smart probably loves it, but when's the last real conversation we had about Georgia? We've talked about Jordan Addison, who we're going to get to later. We've talked about Lincoln Riley. We've talked about Steve Sarkisian in the transfer portal. We've talked about Jim Harbaugh interviewing for NFL jobs. We've talked about Texas A&M, Jimbo Fisher versus Nick Saban. We really, outside of maybe a day or two following the NFL draft, when Georgia set a record with 15 NFL draft picks, we really haven't talked all that much about Georgia this offseason. And so I want to start with, I'm just fascinated to see what they have for an encore. Now, on the one hand, I'll readily admit, I do think that it's hard not to see a scenario where Georgia doesn't take somewhat of a step back. Like I said, they had 15 players selected in the 2022 NFL draft. That is a record. 5 first-rounders all off their defense. That is a record. And so it is hard to imagine. By the way, 2 great running backs, James Cook and Zeus White. Offensive linemen. You go on and on down the list. 15 players lost. I don't care how well you recruit. That's a lot. And then on top of that, here's the other thing, and I'm not criticizing Georgia, and I'm not trying to tear them down. But part of why I have questions and I have to think that Georgia's going to take a step back is because they got kind of lucky in the process last year, right? I talked about it, but they lost in the SEC championship game. Most years, that is a one-way ticket out of the playoff. But last year, the ACC was bad. Last year, the Big 12 was bad. Last year, the Pac-12, again, didn't have a representative. So Georgia gets back in, and then even in the playoff, even in the title game, if Jamison Williams doesn't get hurt, they might not win that game. It doesn't matter. They're the champion. How about my dogs? And the bottom line is they are the defending champ. And I would also say that while I do think that they're probably a half a tier below Alabama and Ohio State coming into the season, what I would also say is this. They're going to be really good. They're going to probably compete for a playoff again. They're going to win the SEC East. And I would also say, even if you think they're going to take a half a step back, I think it's hard to see a scenario where they fall too far. 1, the talent is too good. 2, look at the schedule. Where are the losses? Now, they do open with Oregon, but remember, that game is in Atlanta. They are already as much as a 17-point favorite in the DraftKings Sportsbook. So if you think they're going to lose that opener, you think that's going to go down as one of the biggest upsets in college football this season because a 17-point underdog would reflect that they're one of the bigger underdogs of the season. That would be one of the bigger upsets of the season. Beyond that, look at the schedule. Like I said, yeah, they play Oregon early. But in the cross-division games, here's who they play. They play Auburn at home, at Mississippi State. I'm high on Mississippi State. I don't think they're beating Georgia. They don't play Alabama. They don't play A&M. They don't play LSU. They don't play Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin. And so it's hard to find the losses on the schedule. They get Tennessee at home, I should mention. They get Florida on a neutral field, as they always do with Florida as a first-year head coach. They do play at Kentucky late in the season. That one could be tough, but it is hard to find the losses there. And so to me, I look at Georgia's scenario. As long as they get by Oregon early in the season, most of their quote-unquote big games are later in the season. And I almost wonder if they have almost like a Clemson-type regular season where they can really use the early parts of the schedule. Now, they do play at South Carolina early. They do play Auburn in mid-October. But they get Tennessee late in the season at home. They get game at Kentucky late in the season. And I wonder if they use the season to kind of figure things out as they go on and ramp up late. I expect this team to be the SEC East champ. I expect them to compete for a playoff berth. Georgia, how about my dogs? That is the number one story. What does the year following a national championship look like? Number two, in terms of the second most interesting storyline in the SEC this season, SEC Media Day starting today on Monday if you're listening, earlier in the week on Monday if you're not listening on Monday. Number two is that Alabama revenge tour is going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly for everybody that is in Alabama's wake because here is what is crazy about Alabama. You go back to this time last year. If there was ever a year where Alabama should have taken a step back, last year was the year. Remember, coming into last year, they lost 6 first-round picks from the previous season, 2020, when they won the national championship with Mac Jones as their quarterback. They lost Steve Sarkisian as their play caller and their entire offensive staff. They were breaking in a freshman quarterback. They lost a Heisman Trophy winning wide receiver. They lost in the middle of the season at Texas A&M. We didn't think they were going to make the playoff if they did not play Georgia. Instead, what happens? In a down year, in a rebuilding season, I should say, they go to the national championship game, and as I just said with the Georgia segment, if Jamison Williams, their star wide receiver, first-round pick of the Detroit Lions, if he doesn't get hurt, Alabama might win the national championship game. Everything that happened all regular season, get back to the title game, lose your best wide receiver. You lost your second-best wide receiver, John Mechie, in the national semifinals. You are down a couple starting offensive linemen in that game. You're down a couple defensive backs that are hurt. And Alabama led in the fourth quarter of the national championship game. They were like this close to winning it all. Don't let the final score fool you. That was a close game. And so now, this is actually the year they were building for, and I am terrified of what they are going to look like to the teams. I'm just terrified for the teams that they are going to play because this is going to be a revenge tour, and it is going to be ugly. You look at this team. Again, they were built for this year. They now have, just think about who Alabama has this year. They have the reigning Heisman Trophy winner at quarterback. So literally the best offensive player in college football. They have the best defensive player in college football, and I'll make a case later in the offseason why I believe Will Anderson is going to win the Heisman Trophy, their defensive end. But they have the best defensive player. And then here's the crazy part. We talk about all these changes in college football. There is no doubt that while Nick Saban has vocally been against the transfer portal, he has taken it to his advantage. This offseason, Nick Saban signed potentially 5 starters out of the transfer portal. So remember, they already have the best quarterback in college football, the best offensive player. They already have the best defensive player in college football. Here's who they signed out of the portal. Maybe the best running back in the portal, Jahmyr Gibbs from Georgia Tech. 2 elite wide receivers, Jermaine Burton from Georgia, who's being projected as a first-round pick next year, Tyler Harrell from Louisville. They signed an offensive tackle from Vanderbilt who's expected to start on the offensive line. And they signed maybe the best cornerback in college football, Eli Ricks, who was at LSU, projected to be a top 10 pick in the next NFL draft. Best offensive player, Bryce Young. Best defensive player, Will Anderson. 5 difference makers out of the portal. And on top of it is Nick Saban. I know the schedule is tough. If you look at Alabama's schedule, it's actually legitimately challenging. Week 2, they play at Texas. I know we all make fun of Texas. They should be much improved. They play later in the season at Tennessee. They play at Arkansas. They play at LSU. They play at Ole Miss. It won't be easy, but this is a revenge tour, and Alabama is out for blood. I just mentioned LSU. Here is what is number 3 in my most interesting storylines, the storylines that you need to know heading into SEC Media Days. We have new head coaches at 2 of the premier programs in this conference, Florida and LSU. And it's crazy to me because the parallels between these 2 programs, which are conference rivals, they play every year in a cross-division game, are stunning to me. Both programs 2 years ago, LSU wins a national championship in 2019. I guess it's 3 years ago now coming into this year. Florida plays in 3 straight New Year's 6 bowl games, including an SEC East Division title just 2 seasons ago in COVID. And yet you look at this particular season. Dan Mullen gets fired at Florida, replaced by Billy Napier from Louisiana. We talked about him a few weeks ago. LSU, Brian freaking Kelly is the head coach at LSU. That's maybe the craziest thing about the SEC this year. Brian Kelly is the first speaker on Monday at SEC Media Day. That is insane to me. But what's more interesting is it's not only 2 first-year head coaches. It's not only 2 programs that are going to face each other every year under the current structure of the SEC. And maybe that changes when the new schools, Texas and Oklahoma, come in. But on top of that, the parallels between the 2 programs are pretty similar. LSU, starting with them, just total attrition, right? Injuries, problems. Remember, last time we saw LSU, 40-something players in their bowl game lost to Kansas State. Now coming into this season, they have 4 quarterbacks. They might have none. Garrett Nussmeier, who had been in the program before, he's the only one that actually played there last year. Miles Brennan, who 2 years ago we believed was going to be the replacement of Joe Burrow. He plays about 2 games, gets hurt, looked awesome in those 2 games, has missed the last year and a half. If he's healthy, he's probably the best guy on the roster. Jaden Daniels, transfer from Arizona State. I'm out on him. I don't believe in him. Walker Kessler's the forward from Auburn. Walker Howard, 5-star signee, freshman, probably won't play this year. And so you talk about having 1 quarterback, you have none. They have 4 quarterbacks. I think that's probably not a great sign coming into the year. And then on top of that, there's just not enough depth in most places. They have really good frontline talent. I find it interesting. You look at some mock drafts, some people have them projected with 2-3 first-round draft picks. My boy Kayshon Boutte, maybe the best wide receiver in college football this year. But outside of him and outside of the wide receiver position, there's just not very much depth anywhere. Their front-end defensive line is as good as anybody. They just don't have the dudes over the course of a game. And so it's interesting to look at LSU because they do have the traditional tough LSU schedule. They get Florida on the road, Tennessee at home in cross-division games. Both of those will be tough. And then on top of that, they play Florida State in the opener in the out-of-conference. At some point, I'm going to do like the 5 biggest September games or whatever. I think Florida State LSU is fascinating. Florida State needs a good year, and they need it now for Mike Norvell. So you talk about playing that game in the Superdome. Imagine if you don't win that game in the opener and what it could mean for your season. In terms of Florida, again, the parallels are kind of striking. Now, they're set at quarterback. Anthony Richardson, he doesn't want to be called AR-15 anymore for reasons to do with gun control and stuff. I'm not going to get into that. But he's in at quarterback, and everyone's just like anointing him as whatever. I find it the guy has thrown less than 70 career total passes. And so you have him, but like LSU, there's just not very much depth at most places across the field. They lose their best skill position players either to graduation, NFL draft. Jacob Copeland, their leading wide receiver last year, transferred to Maryland. The defense wasn't very good last year and does not bring back a lot. And the schedule for Florida is absolutely brutal. One of the most intriguing Week 1 games, in my opinion. Florida hosts Utah. You know how good Utah is? Awesome. Utah put up 45 points in the Rose Bowl, lost to Ohio State. They bring back most of their offense, and they're always good defensively. Then in Week 2, Florida plays Kentucky at home. Florida could start 0-2. I don't think that they will, but they could start 0-2. And then, oh, by the way, they have a game at Tennessee before the end of September. There is a scenario where Florida in year 1 under Billy Napier could be 1-3 coming out of September. I don't think it happens, but it is not inconceivable. And so you talk about a crazy setup with 2 first-year head coaches. Number 3 on my list of the 7 biggest stories, LSU and Florida's first-year head coaches.